The Essential Commodities Act was meant to ensure that the Indian consumer did not have to suffer from profiteering. So the stock limits were fixed and anybody exceeding that was prosecuted. This time, we're going to talk about the Essential Commodities Act, which came into force in 1955. This is an era of plenty. You walk into the stores, you find lots of things, consumer goods and foodstuffs on the shelves of physical stores. And whatever you don't find on the stores, you can buy online. So it's virtually an era of plenty. But when the Essential Commodities Act was passed in 1955, it was an era of shortages in this country. And this era had continued for at least 1 or 2 decades. This was a time when very few imported goods were available. Domestic production of consumer goods was also not very high. We also had to face times where there were shortages of food grains, shortages of edible oils, and this act was meant to regulate the production, supply, and distribution of essential commodities so that the ordinary man on the street could get these items at a reasonable price and he didn't have to face profiteering. Now, it covered things apart from food grains and edible oils. It covered pharmaceuticals, kerosene, and other goods like that. Now, you have to remember that the Essential Commodities Act was also overseeing the creation of the fair price shop system, what we call the public distribution system. Though there was a public distribution system before the ECA came into existence, it was expanded tremendously after 1955. And those of you nowadays who really don't know what a ration card is all about, you must recall that when I was a young girl, the ration card was a very important document. Everybody had a ration card. It was universally used, whether you were rich or poor. I mean, my family, my father was a government employee. We were a middle-class family. We had a ration card and our names were listed there. We used to utilize the food grains that were supplied, the sugar and the edible oils. And when I got married, my name was very carefully shifted to my husband's family's ration card. So it served as some kind of an identity card, like an Aadhaar. So the fair price shop system was a universal one those days. Later on, of course, it became more targeted after the liberalization of the economy, after the Green Revolution, of course, in the 60s, when food grains became more easily available. And then, of course, as domestic production of goods increased, availability increased, and people didn't really need to rely on the public distribution system for the products, for the essential products that they used in their daily life. So it was in 1997 that the public distribution system became the targeted public distribution system. And then you could only become eligible for a ration card if you were below the poverty line. But one thing I must mention about the public distribution system, they also provided hydrogenated vegetable oils called vanaspati. Now, you don't see vanaspati much nowadays, but those days it was very popular, and you will all remember it as the brand name of Dalda. Of course, nowadays we consider it's not very healthy to use, but those days for the common man, for the masses, it was considered a very good substitute for ghee, and it was distributed through the public distribution system. But the Essential Commodities Act had another very important role, and that was to curb hoarding by traders. Those days, and of course nowadays also, you would find that traders would hoard foodstuffs, whether it was food grains or edible oils or vegetables, and try to sell it to consumers at inflated prices. So the Essential Commodities Act was meant to ensure that this did not happen by laying down stock limits for traders and penalizing those who violated them. Now, when we come to this kind of profiteering, we must recall that even nowadays, traders are doing that. Sometimes when vegetables are in short supply, whether it's potatoes or onions or tomatoes, you know that traders are hoarding these items and then they are selling them to consumers at a very high price. Now, even at the international level, we can see this happening. The oil cartel, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, limit their production so that prices can remain at a certain height. So this is I think a universal phenomena, but the Essential Commodities Act was meant to ensure that the Indian consumer did not have to suffer from profiteering. So the stock limits were fixed and anybody exceeding that was prosecuted. This law combined with the 1980 Ordinance on Prevention of Black Marketing. And at that time, of course, when the ordinance was passed, there was a concern that this was actually meant to curb political opposition. But the fact is that there were a lot of raids on traders and a lot of action was taken. Now we come to the present. The era of shortages is over. The era of plenty has begun. Stock limits really don't mean anything when you have large supermarkets, when you have food processing companies that need to keep large stocks, when you have multiple supermarkets which need to keep large inventories. So these stock limits now need to be given a second look. So in this new era of plenty, a more realistic approach needs to be taken. And I think we can see that from the data that we have. Between 2009 and 2014, under the Essential Commodities Act, 1.1 million raids were conducted, of which 54,000 people, which is about 5%, were arrested, and 30,000, about 2.7%, were prosecuted. But only 1,381, or 0.12%, were convicted. This shows a potential arbitrariness in the enforcement of the Act, which can be ascribed partly to sins of commission and partly to sins of omission. Now, also taking into account the change scenario on the agricultural front, certain provisions in the Act which prevent large-scale private investment in agriculture need to be given a second look. At the same time, of course, we have to ensure that unscrupulous traders do not try to exploit the people by profiteering. So one of the things that can be done, of course, is to raise stock limits for these kind of categories of institutions that require higher stock limits, higher inventories. As I said, supermarkets, exporters, food processing units. So these are the areas where you need to have some relaxation in the Act. So the Essential Commodities Act is still needed to prevent unscrupulous traders from hoarding and to ensure that the consumer is provided a level playing field. But perhaps we need to find a balance now between the modern needs of a growing economy and the requirements of ensuring that consumers are given a good deal.